Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. So there is teaching, and there is deep teaching, there's mentoring, and there's deep mentoring. We're going to talk today about what those words mean, and my hope is that if you have some propensity to mentor or teach people in any kind of a setting in a way that goes at all deep, and we'll talk about depth, then that you'll get something out of this. There's lots of ways to do this. It can range from informal mentoring all the way up to training graduate students, which is what I've been doing for the last 19 years. So I'm hoping that what we touch on here will helpful for you if you have some desire to work with people. So James Hillman used to come to a school that I attended. He would sit with the students and he would ask questions like, what is depth? And he had a very specific meaning for that because of the tradition of depth psychology, which looks at how the conscious and the unconscious talk to each other. So if you think of not only Freud and Jung, but Pierre Janet, Emma Young, Karen Horney, a number of other people were involved in this. And there's some version of this in every culture. But depth in that sense means looking below the surface, whether that's behavior or daytime consciousness or symptoms, psychological symptoms, and seeing what the dynamics are underneath, what the fantasies and the symbols and the aspirations and the hidden drives are underneath how we behave. So that would be a very psychological way of thinking about depth. But I'm thinking too about depth as in living deeply, as in living as a whole person, as conscious as you can be, but with a quality of consciousness that includes flexibility. So it's not about an absolute quantity of consciousness. In fact, the more conscious you are of doing some things, the less well you do them, right? But more about flexibility or fluidity of consciousness and a tremendous amount of openness, knowing that what we think of as our psychological selves is around us and in our relationships as well as inside us. So to live deeply in this sense means to live in a world of presences, messages, and meanings, rather than a world of mere objects or data or heaps of stuff. It doesn't so much mean thinking into the world, although that's part of it, as feeling and experiencing into the world, really having as much of your experience available as possible. Living deeply also has to do with trying to live wisely and not necessarily being a philosopher in the formal sense, but being clear about what is my framework of meaning? How do I determine what's important to me? What are my ideas and stories about why we're here, about why I'm here? Questions like that traditionally philosophers and spiritual people have looked into. Philosophy literally means love of wisdom. Actually comes from an Egyptian term that means something similar. So if we are talking about philosophy, we're talking about practical philosophy, the kind that we all do that we're usually unconscious of. So getting clear on what our philosophy is, those are all examples, and I could give many more, of living deeply, or at least trying to. So those of us who mentor people are interested in this. We may be teachers, we may be psychotherapists, coaches of different kinds, spiritual counselors or directors of different kinds. Sometimes it takes the form of body practices, so people who teach yoga, people who teach qigong, all of these people, or all of us who want to show something of depth to other people, are involved in this kind of deep mentoring for depth, for living deeply. Mentoring for more fluid states of consciousness that are sustainable. And in our day, speaking of sustainability, we can't really do this and ignore the state of the planet. So deep mentoring and deep teaching at some point have to come to terms with the fact that we're in a state of global ecological crisis, and we are all called to do something about this. And of course, the opportunity as well as the risk is to figure out exactly what that is, because nobody can take all of it on. So it's deep mentoring for me includes encouraging people to ask, how is the world calling out to me in some highly specific way? Something that I can take on to do my part. So one reason for my doing this podcast is that I've noticed that in most of the schools I've worked at, I've been an academic for many years, and then before that, psychotherapy. Most of the schools that I've worked at do not mentor colleagues. They have no succession plan. They every now and then somebody rotates out of a position, and then a search committee forms. But there isn't really a lot of mentoring the next generation of leaders at all. We mentor our students. That's part of what they come for, especially in the kinds of programs I've worked in, but almost no mentoring of colleagues. One exception was many years ago when I worked at John F. Kennedy University. I worked in a program that was within the School of Holistic Studies, and my mentor for some of the years that I was in that program was Marilyn Fowler. And she was very conscious about and conscientious about mentoring people who she worked with, as well as mentoring students. So I want to give a shout out to her. She's a notable exception. But for the most part, I've had to go looking for my mentors, which isn't always easy to do, especially in terms of depth. And mentors don't gather in any particular field. They're scattered all over the place, and sometimes people are momentary mentors who teach us a lesson that's important, but we only may encounter them for a little space of our life. And then other people are more like lifelong mentors. My old English teacher, Sigmar Schwartz, who's now retired, was one of those for a big chunk of my early adulthood. I learned more about psychology from talking to him than I did in any psychology textbook I ever came across. Another reason for doing this is that as I withdraw from working with PhD students, it's opening some space for me to do some reflection and looking back. What did I do well? What did I do poorly? What could I have done better? How can I be better moving forward? And that's one of the qualities that I want to emphasize right up front here, is that deep mentors, deep teachers, must engage in a continual and honest process of self-reflection. We have to be as clear as we can about why we do things, and when we make mistakes, what happened, and if possible, how can we repair that, and to accept it when we can't repair it. So before we go further with these qualities of a deep mentor or deep teacher, we should pause for a moment to note the meaning of the word mentor itself. Comes from a character in the Odyssey by that name. His name was Mentor, and he was the companion, teacher, guardian of Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. And what the reader discovers, but what's not revealed initially, is that Mentor is actually Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So mentoring and wisdom must go together. And wisdom can't merely be intellectual. It has to do with learning from one's experiences, learning deep lessons from one's experiences, and being able to share those learnings with other people and encourage their own deep learnings, which is a big part of deep mentoring. Speaking of wisdom, in myth that and folktales, that archetype tends to show up usually in either fluid or feminine form. It almost never shows up in masculine form. And in fact, I can't even think of a single example. When Carl Jung talks about the wise old man archetype, the figures he uses are all connected with wizards and magicians. They're not per se wisdom gods. I'm not sure there is such a thing. But let me give you a few names across pantheons just as an example. This is a handful from dozens. So, personifications of wisdom in mythology and folklore: Amateras, Atse Astan, otherwise known as First Woman; Ako, Barbilo; Chandi, Eve; Fatima, Guadalupe; Himiko, Mary Magdalene; Mawu, Minerva; Nisaba, Nuwa; Sarasvati, Wadjet, White Buffalo Woman; Yamayo, Xenu, and we could mention many, many others. So, my first quality of a deep mentor, as I mentioned before, was a capacity for sustained self reflection and honest self reflection. Never assuming we know exactly what motivates us, always looking for what's underneath. And what goes with that quality also is a capacity for self compassion. And specifically, having some sort of a relationship with your own inner critic, which in extreme forms is sometimes called the inner saboteur, the inner persecutor, things like that. The part of you that's hard on the rest of you. And learning to step back from that. And bearing in mind that we all make mistakes and fall short. And so the task then isn't to beat ourselves up for it, but to figure out what happened. And to go deeply into that and resolve to do better next time. So self-reflection and self-compassion. And part of self-compassion, too, is self-care. If you're mentoring or teaching people to the point of exhaustion, then it's not good for either you or them. So wise self-care needs to be part of the picture, and emotional support, too. To be a mentor, a deep mentor, requires gathering together some people skills. And I'm thinking about empathy, active listening, the ability to make process comments without therapizing. So let me give you an example of that. Every now and then, as a psychotherapist, so this is more in the therapy arena, but I think it works in other settings too, if we're careful with it. But I would sometimes work with men who had trouble expressing their feelings, and now and then they would say something and it was a really emotionally laden statement, but they weren't reflecting the emotion in how they said it. And so I would sometimes point that out, and I would say, you just made an amazing statement just now, and I'm wondering how you feel about what you just said. I could tell you how I feel about it, but that's an amazing thing you just mentioned. And is there any loss there? Any, that kind of thing, right? So sometimes the ability to step back and look at the process of what's going on rather than just sticking to content that you're providing. That's more like straight up teaching in the traditional sense. But keeping an eye on the process, on what's actually going on around you, in the room, with other people, that kind of thing. So, people skills. People skills include having good boundaries, right? So, when people know in advance that they have a certain amount of time with you and that's it, it tends to actually make them feel more secure. If they can crash your boundaries, it makes them less secure, and it also decreases their respect for you. So, one thing that happens in the classroom as well as in psychotherapy is sometimes people bring up huge issues right at the very end. And I don't permit the session to continue. So I will do two things about this. One is I tell people when the mentoring relationship starts that when we're done for the day, we're done, and that's it. And I stick to that. So then if they do that, if they come in late with some huge thing, I'll say, well, just to remind you, we're going to be respectful of time boundaries here. Let's pick that up next time. And if it continues, then that needs looking at, right? There needs to be a conversation about what doing things at the very end that are big means to them and why they suppose they're doing that, right? All of this is in service to having good boundaries around time. So, in general, and this applies to teaching, especially in any kind of a teaching setting, the teacher must control the structure and the environment. You have to regulate the boundaries. And I found it useful in mentoring in general, deep mentoring in particular, to provide some kind of structure. For a lot of people, it's not helpful if they show up and the mentor says something like, well, how do you want to use your time today, right? I mean, if they knew that, they might not need any mentoring. So the extremes here to avoid are just leaving them all at sea and providing so much structure that it doesn't work for them and it ignores what they're bringing. And there's many ways of handling this. You can up front, agree on how the time's going to be used, whatever mentoring kind of relationship it is, and talk about that. An example of that would be when I teach online classes, usually I provide the lecture material through audio or video, and then I do live sessions, whether it's in person or on video. And for the live sessions, I tell the students up front, bring the things you want to talk about. Maybe you have some dreams you want to get into. Maybe you noticed something outwardly that paralleled something in the course material. Maybe there was a current event that you want to analyze in terms of the ideas in the course. So bring something, and then we'll get into it. So then when they come to those live sessions, they know already that they're expected to bring something. I've already given them the lecture. They don't need more lecturing. We're here to do application, right? Where we want to apply what we're learning. A good mentor should be knowledgeable. Knowledgeable in terms of the learnings, the lore, the ideas, the practices, whatever it is that you're going to work with in your mentoring relationship. And I'm thinking of times in higher ed that pop up now and then when somebody, usually an administrator, says, oh, can you just pick this class up over here and teach it? It's related to what you do. And, sometimes that's okay. You can step in at the last minute. But I did that once many years ago in an area that was related to psychotherapy, but it wasn't something that I had much experience in or specialized in. And I always felt about that class that the students didn't get out of it as much as they should have, and they really needed to bring somebody in who was more knowledgeable in that area. So since then, I've been very strict about turning down any kind of teaching or mentoring, whether it's in higher ed or elsewhere, where I honestly don't feel qualified. And here's another self-inquiry piece, right? Because some mentors of various kinds have a bit of imposter syndrome going, and you might actually know a lot more than you think you know. So you have to be clear on what exactly you do know and whether it fits your audience. It's something to be crystal clear about. And so if you're just plain not qualified, then you shouldn't step up. You should refuse. And as a sidebar, when you're looking for any kind of mentoring or teaching or coaching work, and your potential employer, especially if it's a school or some large organization, when they're very specific about what you need by way of required skills and experience, okay, they mean that. And I can't tell you how much time has been wasted when I've been in management positions and administrator positions, and I get mountains of job applications from people who are clearly not qualified for the position. Don't waste people's time with this stuff, right? If you're qualified, apply for it. If you're not, go somewhere else. So, and do yourself a favor, as well as your mentees and your students. Now, this next quality has to do with this odd source of envy that comes up sometimes. I've seen it in my some of my colleagues. Fortunately, most of them don't have it, but I think about the schools of psychology that have popped up and the narcissistic outrage by people like Freud and Jung that their followers didn't stick to the party line. And that's just the opposite of good mentoring. You want your mentees or students or whatever you want to call them to move beyond you and to take the ideas that you've given them and combine them with other ideas that came from elsewhere and practices and insights. And you want them to go in directions that you never could have anticipated. That's how good knowledge and practice grow. That's how wisdom spreads. So if you feel threatened in any way by the fact that somebody's brilliant or insightful or makes use of the material you provide in ways that never occurred to you, you need to look at that and actually consider whether you should be mentoring people. It should be a key desire of mentoring to want to be surpassed. You want the people who come after you to do better than you, to see farther, to move farther, to walk more distantly into the world. And it's a joy when they do. I've been able to experience that joy many times. I've been fortunate enough to have really insightful, brilliant, creative mentees and students and clients over the years. And it gives me joy to see them go in directions that I never would have thought of and succeed. It's wonderful. That's why we do this. Another quality of mentoring, deep mentoring, is patience, which is something that my poor dad never had. I had some really great teachers from early on, to which I'm still grateful. And they were such a contrast to what happened at home because he was so impatient and abusive. And one of the lessons I got from that was never to be that way with other people. And so being patient with people, giving them the room to do their own exploring, accompanying them when they're confused, those are qualities that a good mentor should have as well. As part of that patience, you also want to create opportunities for them to work with the material in their own way, come to their own conclusions, do their own exploring. You don't want to be in the position of just telling them what to do. That's more authoritarian than mentoring. And I see this sometimes in work with dreams in groups where people who are new to the practice start making these authoritative statements like, well, your dream symbolizes this. And, the only person who can say what their experience means is the person having the experience, not you. And on a mental level, you may have more psychological insight in the moment than they do, but it doesn't do them any good, especially if you try to substitute yours for theirs. So that's an authority move we don't want to make. We want to create opportunities for them to get there on their own and to realize that if there's something a person is defending against or simply not realizing, maybe they're not supposed to right now. Maybe their defenses are wiser than we are. And so we need to pay attention to that. So, stated negatively, never make yourself an expert on somebody else's process. My very first psychotherapy teacher had a really nice comment about this. There was a room full of us all nervous about seeing our first clients, and he said to us at one point, this was Felipe Santana, wonderful teacher and mentor, and he said, don't worry so much about risks and safety and stuff like that, because we've taught you how to deal with those situations. People are suicidal, people are addicts, whatever. You know what referrals you need to make and what steps you need to carry out. He said there's one time in particular when you should worry, and that's when you know exactly what's going on with somebody. When you are telling yourself, aha, I know what this person needs. I know exactly what this symptom means. I know what this dream means, whatever it is. Because when you're in a state of certainty, the inquiry is over until you get uncertain again. And it's the same with any kind of deep mentoring. No conclusion final. Another quality of deep mentoring is to know when you can't mentor somebody. Because you can't mentor everybody. There are some people that you can't reach. They come to you because they've projected something onto you. Maybe they're making you their hero or savior or mom or dad or whatever it is. But at some point, you realize that you're working harder than they are, that they aren't really getting anywhere, that they're just as bewildered as they were previously, and you can't help them. And so, to be honest about that and to send them elsewhere where somebody may be able to help them. There are just certain people you don't go with well. Um, and that loops back actually to the self inquiry piece, and it can be helpful to actually make a list of people you can't mentor. So, one of the things on my list is I can't mentor people who are stuck in victim thinking. Now, that doesn't mean people who are victims. There's most of us probably were victimized at one time or another. This means the victim pose, the victim position psychologically, the people who are determined to see themselves as disempowered and to blame other people for what happened to them. I might give such people a try or two, but it generally doesn't work out, and then I send them somewhere else. And I'm honest with them about why I can't work with them. As long as you're stuck in victim thinking, I don't think you're going to move forward. So it's good to know who you can't mentor. Another quality of good, deep mentoring is being able to help people clarify what they really want, what they most desire. Most of us grow up knowing what we should want, what people tell us we should want, what our teachers or clerics or pastors or whoever, family members, what they say we should want. We know all that. It's been drummed into us since infancy. But it's much more difficult to know what you really want. Deep down, at a soul level, what do you want? What do you want out of life? What do you want out of relationships? What sort of work in the world do you want to do? Not what you should do, what you most deeply desire. And so deep mentoring speaks to that by allowing opportunities for people to discover that on their own. And what you'll notice when you mentor people on that path is that they're very good at producing what they should want, and they will come up with all kinds of thoughts about that. And you need to keep putting that back on them. Okay, well, I get that you feel you should want that. Or I get that's what you've been told, but I'm not feeling any alchemical fire in you when you talk about that. You say that like it's more like a rote response. And I'm actually wondering what part of you that comes from. Is that maybe the parent within talking, or somebody else, or your cultural background, or whatever? It's sometimes very hard to know what you really want. And one way to make a breakthrough is to help people engage their imagination and do some fantasizing about what they want, or to be open to those parts of life that suddenly infuse them with joy and a deep drive to move in a different direction. And sometimes dreams can reveal a lot about this too. You can have them go to sleep asking the question of their unconscious. What are they? What do I want? What at this point in my life? What would be good? And to also trace what's dying for them. What they're hanging on to that they should be letting go of. Attitudes, forms of work, relationships, self-concepts, institutes that they're loyal to, whatever it is. And sometimes that death needs to occur before they really do discover what they want. So I might be offering a class on deep mentoring. Let me know if you're interested. Thanks so much.